You know, I was sitting with my coffee this morning, just staring at it. Not scrolling. Not listening to anything. Just sitting. And I caught myself feeling guilty about it. Like, why am I not doing something useful right now? Why am I not learning, or fixing myself, or helping someone, or becoming better? And that's when it hit me how deep this thing goes. Because even rest now feels like something you have to deserve. We've been taught quietly, subtly. That being good means being available. That being kind means saying yes. That being educated, aware, evolved means always thinking about everyone else before yourself. And honestly, I think we're exhausted because of it. We're the most informed generation. We know about trauma, systems, privilege, healing, boundaries. And yet, I don't know a lot of people who actually feel okay. Sometimes it feels like we've learned everything. Except how to listen to the part of us that just wants to survive. Like, we don't trust that part anymore. Because somewhere along the way, selfish became a bad word. Selfish meant careless, immature, unkind. But I keep thinking, what if being selfish is actually the most natural thing we were ever meant to be? Every living thing on this planet wakes up and chooses itself first. Not because it's evil, but because if it doesn't, it dies. No animal wakes up and thinks, let me ignore my hunger so I don't seem selfish. But we do. We override hunger, rest, intuition, desire. We intellectualize ourselves out of survival. And I think that's dangerous. Because when you keep choosing everyone else, you don't become more loving. You become invisible to yourself. This episode isn't about becoming harsh or cold or self-obsessed. It's about remembering that taking care of yourself is not a moral failure. It's a biological one. So if this year you feel a pull to be a little more selfish, to protect your energy, your body, your time, maybe that's not regression. Maybe that's instinct coming back online. And I want to talk about that today. Slowly. Honestly. Like friends would. Over coffee, without trying to fix each other. Just telling the truth. So, yeah. Welcome to Coremates. I'm here with Elen again, coffee in hand, and today we're talking about why this year, being a little selfish might actually be the most human thing we can do. Yeah. When you were talking just now, I felt this tightness in my chest because it's so familiar. That guilt you mentioned, I feel it all the time. Even when I finally stop, even when I rest, there's this voice that says, okay, but shouldn't you be doing more? And what scares me is that it's not loud. It's quiet. It sounds reasonable. It tells you you're being mature, responsible, aware. But underneath that, I think there's fear. Fear that if we choose ourselves, we'll disappoint someone. Fear that we'll be seen as lazy, or ungrateful, or not good enough. And I keep wondering, when did taking care of ourselves start to feel like something we need to justify? Because like you said, no part of our body asks for permission to breathe, or to heal, or to survive. So why do we? When you asked, why do we? It really stayed with me, because when I slow down and actually look at my everyday life, I realize it's not some big dramatic moment where I choose everyone else over myself. It's these really small, almost invisible decisions. Like answering messages when my body already feels done for the day. Staying available even when I feel myself shrinking a little. Explaining myself, softening my words, making sure no one feels uncomfortable, even when I'm the one who's exhausted. And because it's quiet, because it looks polite and normal, it never gets questioned. Not by others. And not by me. Yeah. And I think that's exactly why it's so dangerous. Because none of us wake up with the intention of abandoning ourselves. It's more like this constant internal negotiation, just a bit more, just a bit longer, I'll take care of myself after this. And the thing is, after becomes this imaginary place we never arrive at. There's always one more thing, one more responsibility, one more reason why now isn't the right time to stop. So we keep going, not because we're okay, but because stopping feels heavier than continuing. And what really messes with your sense of reality is that this behavior gets rewarded. People don't see the cost. They just see the output. They call you reliable. They say you're strong, generous, emotionally intelligent. No one ever says, you look like you're constantly overriding yourself. No one asks what it takes from you to always be that available. So you start to believe that this is just who you are. Not something you're doing, but something you are.
Exactly.
And at some point, I noticed that I wasn't even choosing things because I wanted to anymore. I was choosing them because I didn't want to deal with the guilt that came with saying no. It's like my decisions stopped being about desire or capacity and started being about emotional damage control. What's the least uncomfortable option? What will make me feel like a good person? And the scariest part is how reasonable that voice sounds. It doesn't scream. It doesn't threaten. It just quietly convinces you that choosing yourself would be selfish, immature, or disappointing. That's such an important point because that voice doesn't feel cruel. It feels educated. It feels mature. And I think that's where rest completely lost its innocence. Rest doesn't feel like something natural anymore. It feels like something you need to justify. Like you're skipping something important. Like you're falling behind. I've caught myself resting and still feeling tense, as if my body is waiting for consequences.
Yes.
Rest feels suspicious now. And honestly, I think a lot of that comes from how much information we're constantly consuming. We're always learning, always listening, always improving. There's always another book, another podcast, another post explaining what you should be doing better, emotionally, socially, morally. And while knowledge can be beautiful, it can also become overwhelming. Because suddenly every feeling has to be analyzed instead of trusted. Exactly. We don't just feel tired, we diagnose it. We don't just feel angry, we unpack it. We don't just want to stop, we question whether we're avoiding something. And at some point, it feels like instinct isn't allowed anymore unless it's approved by logic. We've trained ourselves to pause every impulse and ask, is this justified? Is this healthy? Is this allowed? But survival doesn't work like that.
No. Survival is fast. It's direct.
It doesn't explain itself. And I think overeducation culture, especially for our generation, taught us to distrust that speed. We were told to be aware, reflective, informed, which is good. But no one told us when reflection turns into self-surveillance. No one taught us how to stop thinking long enough to feel what our body is actually asking for. And the body keeps asking, quietly, patiently, through exhaustion, through resentment, through numbness. But instead of listening, we keep reaching for more information, more understanding, more frameworks, as if knowledge alone will save us from burnout. I see this so clearly in people around me, friends who are incredibly educated, deeply aware, emotionally articulate, and completely drained. They know all the language. They can explain their patterns perfectly, but they don't feel alive inside them anymore. It's like their mind is running the show, and their body is just trying to keep up. I've been that person too. Reading instead of resting. Understanding instead of stopping. Because stopping felt irresponsible. Like giving up. And somewhere in that, selfishness became this ugly word. Because selfishness sounds like listening to yourself without asking for permission. And that's terrifying in a culture where being good is tied to being useful. Where value comes from contribution, productivity, awareness. Choosing yourself feels like stepping out of line. When in reality, choosing yourself is the oldest instinct we have. Before education. Before morality. Before systems. We survived because we listened to hunger, fear, exhaustion, not because we debated them. Which makes me wonder, what if being selfish isn't the problem? What if the real danger is how disconnected we've become from the instinct to protect ourselves? Yeah, what if ignoring that instinct is what's actually unnatural? Because when you think about it that way, selfishness stops sounding like a flaw. It starts sounding like memory. And maybe that's the work, not becoming something new, but remembering how to choose ourselves before we learn to feel guilty for it. What really started to change things for me was realizing that this struggle isn't happening because we're confused or emotionally immature. It's happening because we're trying to live in a way that constantly goes against how our bodies were designed to function. There's a part of us that existed long before language, before education, before any idea of what it means to be a good or bad person, and that part has one very simple responsibility: to keep us alive long enough to continue. And that part doesn't negotiate. It doesn't moralize. It doesn't explain itself. It responds.
Yes.
And I think that's what feels so grounding once you really let it sink in, that our nervous system isn't here to help us succeed in the world. It's here to help us survive it. Its first question is never, is this kind? Or is this impressive? It's always, am I safe enough to stay? And when safety feels unstable, emotionally, physically, socially, the body doesn't care how good our intentions are. It shifts into protection mode automatically, which makes so many of our experiences suddenly make sense. The exhaustion that doesn't go away with sleep. The irritability that feels out of character. The numbness that creeps in quietly and stays. Those aren't personal failures, they're signals. They're the body saying this pace, this pressure, this level of self-neglect is not survivable. And what breaks my heart a little is how often we turn those signals against ourselves. We call them weakness, lack of discipline, failure to cope. Instead of recognizing that the body is doing exactly what it's meant to do, pulling energy inward, conserving resources, slowing us down before something breaks completely. In that sense, burnout isn't collapse. It's intervention. Yes, it's the body stepping in where the mind refused to listen. Because the mind can rationalize almost anything. It can tell you why pushing makes sense, why rest can wait, why your needs aren't urgent. But the body doesn't speak in arguments. It speaks in sensations. And when those sensations are ignored for too long, they get louder or they disappear. Which is often when people say, I don't recognize myself anymore. They're not broken, they're disconnected. Disconnected from the part of themselves that knows when enough is enough, because that part kept being overridden in the name of productivity, responsibility, or being perceived as good. When you look at nature, this becomes almost painfully obvious. No animal survives by being endlessly selfless. No organism sacrifices its basic needs for the comfort of the group without consequence. Rest, hunger, protection, these aren't luxuries in nature. They're laws. And animals don't apologize for them. They don't feel shame for resting. They don't question whether they deserve food. They don't push themselves to the edge to prove their worth. Their worth is inherent, measured by existence, not output. Which is something we've completely forgotten. We've layered morality, identity, and value over biology. And then wondered why we feel so lost inside our own bodies. The nervous system doesn't understand social expectations. It understands safety, danger, depletion, and restoration. When we repeatedly ignore our needs, the body doesn't think we're noble. It thinks we're in danger. And living in that state long-term, even quietly, changes you. It narrows your world. It dulls your joy. It makes even simple decisions feel heavy. Not because you're incapable, but because your system is exhausted from being asked to survive without support. Which is why selflessness, when it's constant and unquestioned, can actually be deeply destabilizing. Not emotionally, biologically. Because choosing everyone else over yourself again and again sends a very clear message to the nervous system. Your needs are not important. And that message has consequences. It leads to anxiety, because the body never feels secure. It leads to numbness, because feeling becomes too much. It leads to dissociation, because staying present feels unsafe. These aren't personality traits, they're adaptations. And this is where I think the word selfish needs to be reclaimed. Because in its most basic form, selfishness just means self-preservation. It means acknowledging that this body has limits, that energy is finite, and that survival requires choosing yourself before you can choose anything else. And that choice isn't dramatic or aggressive. It's quiet. It's listening when your body says no, and believing it without interrogation. It's resting before collapse, eating before depletion, leaving before resentment, and trusting that doing so doesn't make you less human. It makes you more aligned with how life actually works. Which is why this idea feels so threatening in our culture. Because systems function better when people override themselves. When they keep giving, keep producing, keep caring, even when it costs them everything. But the body always knows the truth. And eventually, it asks to be chosen. Not as an act of rebellion, but as an act of survival. Maybe that's the real invitation here. Not to become selfish in a harsh way, but to become loyal to ourselves again, to stop asking permission to survive. I've been thinking a lot about how strange it is that we live in a time where information is everywhere, not just accessible, but constant, and yet, so many people feel more confused about themselves than ever before. We've learned how to name everything: emotions, systems, patterns, trauma, power dynamics. We've learned how to analyze behavior from every possible angle. But somehow, in the process of learning so much about life, we've lost touch with how it actually feels to live inside our own bodies.
Yes.
And I think that loss happens very quietly, which is why it's so hard to notice. It's not like one day you wake up and decide not to trust yourself anymore. It happens through small moments, when you feel something instinctively, and instead of responding to it, you pause and ask yourself whether that feeling is informed enough, fair enough, or morally correct enough to act on. And slowly, that pause becomes permanent. Exactly. The instinctive response gets delayed long enough that it starts to dissolve. You don't stop feeling, but you stop believing what you feel. And instead of your body being the first source of information, it becomes something you need to double-check against what you've learned, what you've read, or what you think a good person would do. Which sounds responsible on the surface, but over time it creates this internal hierarchy where intellect is trusted and instinct is treated like a problem that needs supervision. And that hierarchy is exhausting. Because instincts don't disappear just because you ignore them, they wait. They show up later as anxiety, resentment, chronic fatigue, or a vague sense that your life doesn't quite belong to you anymore. I think that's where overeducation quietly turns into self-surveillance. You're constantly watching yourself from the outside, monitoring your reactions, editing your needs, softening your boundaries. Not because you're manipulative, but because you've been taught that being aware means being careful. Careful not to take too much. Careful not to inconvenience. Careful not to be seen as selfish. And what no one tells you is that living in that constant state of self-correction slowly disconnects you from your survival instincts. Because survival instincts are fast. They're not polite. They don't wait for approval. They exist to protect you before harm has time to justify itself. But in our culture, speed is mistrusted. Immediate reactions are framed as immature. Gut feelings are dismissed as biased. Discomfort is something you're expected to sit with even when it's telling you that something is fundamentally wrong. And so people learn to stay in situations that drain them, hurt them, or quietly erode them because leaving feels like a failure of understanding rather than an act of self-preservation. And that's where selflessness becomes dangerous. Because it stops being a choice and starts becoming a moral expectation. You're not just encouraged to consider others, you're expected to prioritize them, even when doing so costs you your health, your energy, or your sense of self. And if you don't, there's guilt. Subtle guilt. Intellectual guilt. The kind that sounds reasonable. Yes, the most effective guilt is always the one that sounds intelligent. It tells you that you're privileged enough to endure more. Aware enough to carry more. Strong enough to sacrifice yourself quietly. And when you believe that, you stop seeing self-neglect as a problem, you start seeing it as proof of character. Which is heartbreaking, because character built on self-erasure doesn't lead to integrity, it leads to depletion. You can't build a meaningful life while constantly stepping away from your own needs. Eventually, the body notices. And the body always notices. It responds with exhaustion that doesn't resolve. With emotional flatness that no amount of insight fixes. With a nervous system that's permanently braced, waiting for relief that never comes. Not because you're weak, but because you've been asking yourself to live in contradiction with your biology. That contradiction shows up so clearly when you look at nature. No organism survives by overriding its signals indefinitely. If an animal is tired, it rests. If it's threatened, it leaves. If resources are scarce, it protects what it has. There's no moral debate, just responsiveness. And what's wild is that we call ourselves more evolved, yet we expect humans to do what no other living system can do sustainably, ignore their limits without consequence. We act shocked when people burn out, detach, or collapse, as if the outcome isn't predictable. Especially when we teach people to intellectualize pain instead of responding to it. to explain discomfort instead of honoring it, to stay in situations that feel wrong because leaving might make them appear selfish, ungrateful, or insufficiently evolved. But survival doesn't care about appearing evolved. It cares about continuity. And if you remove self-protection from the equation, what you're left with is a person who knows how to survive for others, but not for themselves, which is not sustainable. Not psychologically, not neurologically, not biologically. And maybe that's the quiet truth we're circling here. That selfishness, in its most basic form, isn't about taking too much. It's about refusing to disappear. And maybe remembering that isn't a step backward. Maybe it's a return to something essential. And when you stay with this long enough, when you really allow yourself to notice how widespread this pattern is, how many people are exhausted, anxious, emotionally flat despite doing everything right, it becomes impossible not to question the narrative that this is just an individual problem. Because if so many people are struggling in the same way, across different lives, backgrounds, and personalities, then maybe what we're looking at isn't failure, it's design. And that question alone changes everything. Yes. Because the moment you stop asking what's wrong with me and start asking what am I being shaped for, you shift out of shame and into clarity. You start seeing that this constant encouragement to be flexible, understanding, endlessly accommodating, especially without clear limits, fits very neatly into systems that need people to keep going, even when they're depleted. Not because those systems are evil, but because they're efficient. Exactly. Systems don't survive by caring about individual well-being. They survive by maintaining output, stability, and predictability. And people who don't prioritize themselves, who second-guess their limits, who feel guilty for resting or stepping back, are incredibly easy to integrate into that kind of structure. They don't disrupt the flow. They don't demand change. They absorb pressure quietly. And what makes this so powerful is that it rarely feels like exploitation. It feels like responsibility, like maturity, like being the bigger person. You're not forced to give more, you're praised for it. And praise is often more effective than pressure because it makes self-sacrifice feel like a personal choice rather than something you're being trained into. Especially when that praise is wrapped in moral language. Words like empathy, resilience, gratitude, and understanding, which are genuinely beautiful human qualities, get subtly repurposed into tools that keep people compliant. They're no longer about connection. They're about endurance. And endurance, without rest, eventually becomes self-abandonment. Because when someone believes they always need to be patient, always need to see the other side, always need to carry the emotional weight, they stop asking whether the situation itself is sustainable. They internalize conflict instead of addressing it. They normalize imbalance. And the system benefits from that normalization. Workplaces run smoother when people don't question workload. Families remain peaceful when someone consistently swallows their needs. Relationships avoid rupture when one person keeps adjusting. But that smoothness is deceptive, because it's paid for privately, in chronic stress that lives in the body, in emotional numbness that creeps in slowly, in a quiet resentment that has nowhere to go. And since that cost isn't immediately visible, it's easy for everyone else, and even the person paying it, to pretend it doesn't exist. That's why selflessness is so often celebrated, but rarely protected. We praise people for giving everything, but we don't create structures that support them when they're exhausted. We admire resilience, but we don't question why so much resilience is needed in the first place. And when someone finally reaches their limit, when their body forces a stop through burnout, anxiety, or illness, the response is often individual again. Take time off. Go to therapy. Work on yourself. As if the problem was a personal malfunction, not the predictable result of prolonged self-neglect. Which is where selfishness starts to look very different. Not as a lack of care, but as a refusal to continue absorbing pressure that was never meant to be carried alone. Not as indifference, but as discernment. As the decision to stop being endlessly available to systems, dynamics, or expectations that don't reciprocate care. As the recognition that your body, your nervous system, your energy, these are not infinite resources. They are living systems that require protection to function. And when you begin to choose yourself in that way, it can feel deeply uncomfortable, not because it's wrong, but because it disrupts what others have grown used to. It introduces friction where there was silence. It asks for adjustment instead of endurance. And friction is often labeled as selfishness, because it's easier to criticize the person who changes than to question the structure that depended on their compliance. Which makes me think that selfishness, in this context, isn't about taking more than your share. It's about refusing to disappear for the sake of stability. It's about choosing sustainability over approval. And maybe that's why reclaiming selfishness feels so radical. Because it quietly challenges everything that benefits from your self-neglect. And maybe that's the point. I keep coming back to the word itself, selfish, because I think so much of our resistance lives there. It's a word that was never meant to describe biology, but somehow became a moral judgment about character. And when you really slow down and listen to what we've been talking about, the nervous system, survival, limits, sustainability, it becomes clear that what we're describing doesn't fit that moral framing at all. It fits something much older. Yes, it fits something preverbal. Something that existed before we had language to evaluate ourselves, before we learned to categorize behavior as good or bad, mature or immature, evolved or regressive. It's the part of life that simply knows when something is too much and responds without commentary. And I think that's what makes this so confronting, because it asks us to trust a kind of intelligence that doesn't explain itself. And we've been trained to distrust anything that doesn't come with a justification. If you can't articulate a reason, you're encouraged to override the impulse. If you can't defend your boundary logically, you're taught to soften it. If you can't prove that your need is valid, you're expected to postpone it. So self-protection becomes something you're allowed to do only after it's been approved by reason, morality, or consensus. Which completely misunderstands how protection works. Because by the time something becomes explainable, it's often already too late. The body doesn't wait for harm to become obvious. It reacts to patterns, to subtle cues, to accumulated signals that the conscious mind hasn't yet processed. That's not weakness. That's intelligence operating faster than language. And when we ignore that intelligence long enough, we don't become more ethical, we become disconnected. We start living from the neck up, making decisions that sound good on paper but feel wrong in practice. We stay in relationships that drain us because we can rationalize them. We accept workloads that exhaust us because we can explain why they're necessary. We override discomfort because it doesn't seem serious enough to justify disruption. And over time, that constant overriding does something very specific to the nervous system. It teaches it that its signals are unreliable, that its warnings will be ignored. That safety depends not on responsiveness, but on endurance. And a nervous system that learns that lesson doesn't relax, it braces. Which is why so many people feel tense even in moments that are supposed to be safe. Why rest feels restless. Why stillness feels uncomfortable. The body hasn't learned that it will be protected when it speaks. So when we talk about selfishness in this context, we're really talking about restoring that trust. Teaching the body that its signals matter again. That hunger, exhaustion, emotional overwhelm, and the urge to withdraw are not inconveniences to be managed, but information to be respected. And that respect doesn't make you colder. It doesn't make you less caring. It actually prevents you from becoming resentful, bitter, or emotionally unavailable over time. Because care that's given while self-abandoning always has a shelf life. Eventually, it curdles. Not because the person didn't care, but because they cared without capacity. And that's the difference no one teaches us. Capacity is biological. It depends on sleep, safety, nourishment, emotional regulation. You cannot think your way into having more capacity. You can only protect it. Which means that choosing yourself in small, quiet, often invisible ways is not a moral failure. It's a form of maintenance. The same way you wouldn't call it selfish to charge a phone before it dies, or to repair structure before it collapses. But we do call humans selfish for doing the same thing. For stopping before they break. For leaving before they resent. For resting before they collapse. And that tells us something important. It tells us that what we label as selfishness is often just the moment someone stops being endlessly available, stops being absorbent, stops translating their own limits into something more palatable for others. And that moment feels threatening, not because it's harmful, but because it reintroduces boundaries into spaces that were benefiting from their absence. Which is why reclaiming selfishness doesn't feel empowering at first. It feels destabilizing. Because it forces a reorganization, internally and externally. But that reorganization is what makes sustainable connection possible. Because when people choose themselves honestly, they don't disappear, they show up more fully. They give less, but what they give is real. And maybe that's the reframe we need. That selfishness, when grounded in self-awareness and respect for the body, isn't about taking more. It's about finally stopping the slow act of self-erasure. And once you stop erasing yourself, something shifts. You don't become less human. You become whole again. As we're sitting here talking, what keeps coming back to me is how misleading the word choice can be when we talk about selflessness. Because when I look back, I don't remember a clear moment where I consciously decided to put myself last. I remember a series of small, almost invisible adjustments, each one reasonable on its own, that slowly taught me that my needs were negotiable, optional, something that could always be handled later. Yes. And that's such an important distinction, because self-erasure rarely begins with self-hatred. It usually begins with good intentions, with the desire to be reliable, to be understanding, to not create conflict, to not become someone who makes things harder for others. And those intentions are deeply human. I think that's why it took me so long to recognize what was happening. Every time I felt tired, I told myself it was temporary. Every time something felt heavy, I reframed it as part of growth. Every time my body signaled discomfort, I searched for a way to interpret that signal as something I should overcome rather than respond to. And because I could always find a reasonable explanation, I never stopped. And reasoning can be incredibly dangerous when it's disconnected from the body. Because reasoning doesn't feel pain, it justifies it. It can always find a narrative that makes endurance seem noble and rest seem indulgent. So instead of asking, "What do I need right now?" you start asking, "What's expected of me?" Exactly. And once expectations become louder than sensations, something fundamental shifts. You stop inhabiting your body fully. You start living slightly outside of yourself, constantly monitoring how you're perceived, how useful you're being, how well you're holding everything together. And that distance becomes normal. I relate to that so deeply. For me, it showed up as emotional competence. I became very good at understanding people, at holding space, at naming dynamics and diffusing tension. But what I didn't realize at the time was that I was using understanding as a way to avoid setting boundaries. Because boundaries risk disappointment. They introduce friction. They break the image of being easy, adaptable, emotionally evolved. And when your sense of safety is tied to being perceived as good or mature, boundaries feel dangerous, even when they're necessary. So instead of responding to discomfort, I analyzed it. I told myself that if I could just see the bigger picture, the pain would dissolve. And sometimes it did, temporarily. But the body keeps records. Yes. And eventually, those records start showing up whether you're ready or not. For me, it wasn't a dramatic breakdown. It was a slow dulling. Joy became quieter. Motivation felt heavier. Rest stopped feeling like rest because my nervous system no longer trusted that stopping was safe. That's such a key point. Because when you override yourself long enough, rest doesn't feel restorative, it feels unsafe. The body has learned that stillness is when you get behind, when you fail, when you disappoint. So, even in moments of quiet, there's tension. And I remember thinking, what's wrong with me? I have everything I need. But the problem wasn't gratitude. It was disconnection. I had trained myself to meet external demands while ignoring internal signals, and my body had adapted by staying in a constant low-level state of alert. For me, that alertness showed up as anxiety that didn't have a clear cause. Not panic, just a constant hum, like my system was always waiting for something to go wrong. And no amount of insight helped, because insight doesn't create safety. Responsiveness does. That was the moment I realized something painful but clarifying. I hadn't been choosing myself, not because I didn't deserve it, but because I had learned that choosing myself was something you do only after everything else is handled. And everything else was never done. Which is the trap. There is always another responsibility, another person, another reason to wait. And if you don't interrupt that pattern intentionally, your life quietly becomes something you manage rather than inhabit. Choosing myself didn't look dramatic when I finally started. It didn't feel empowering. It felt awkward, uncertain, like stepping out of a role without knowing who I was without it. And that's something people don't talk about enough. When you stop being selfless, you don't immediately feel free. You feel exposed, because you're no longer hiding behind usefulness or endurance. But slowly, and this part matters, my body began to respond. I felt moments of genuine calm. I laughed without effort. I noticed my own preferences again. And those changes weren't philosophical, they were physiological. Which is how I knew this wasn't selfishness in the destructive sense. It wasn't about taking more. It was about returning to sensation, to presence, to a life that felt inhabited from the inside. And once you experience that, even briefly, it becomes impossible to unsee how much selflessness had cost. Not just in energy, but in intimacy with yourself. And maybe that's the quiet truth underneath all of this, that choosing yourself isn't an act against others. It's an act of coming back into your own life. I think this is where the conversation usually breaks down for people, not because they disagree, but because they don't know how to translate all of this into real life without turning into someone they don't recognize. Because choosing yourself sounds powerful in theory, but in daily life it's rarely loud or dramatic. Most of the time, it's subtle, almost boring. And that's what makes it hard to trust. Yes, because we're used to associating change with intensity, with big decisions, bold statements, clear moments of transformation. But the kind of selfishness we're talking about doesn't announce itself like that. It shows up in the small, private moments where no one is watching, where you either listen to yourself or override yourself one more time. For me, the first shift wasn't about boundaries with other people. It was about boundaries with myself. About noticing how often I agreed internally to things my body had already said no to, and how quickly I talked myself out of that no. I realized that before I could change my behavior outwardly, I had to stop betraying myself inwardly. That internal betrayal is such a key point, because most people don't exhaust themselves by saying yes out loud, they exhaust themselves by saying no inside, and then ignoring it. They feel the hesitation, the heaviness, the resistance, and instead of responding to it, they immediately override it with reasoning. And that override becomes a habit. So daily life selfishness started very simply for me. It meant pausing, just long enough to notice what my body was doing before my mind stepped in to explain it away. Was my chest tightening? Was my energy dropping? Was there a sense of contraction instead of openness? And instead of asking whether that reaction was justified, I started asking whether it was informative. That shift alone changes everything. Because once you treat bodily responses as information rather than obstacles, you stop trying to defeat yourself. You stop seeing discomfort as something that needs to be conquered in order to be good, mature, or capable. You start seeing it as feedback. And feedback doesn't demand immediate action, but it does demand respect. Sometimes respecting it meant doing nothing, letting a message sit unanswered, not committing right away, allowing myself to say, "I'll get back to you," without already preparing the guilt that usually followed. That's such a powerful but underestimated practice, because urgency is one of the main ways selflessness is enforced. If you always need to respond quickly, you never get the space to check in with yourself. You end up living in reaction mode, where other people's needs automatically outrank your own internal state. And slowing down felt uncomfortable at first. Not because it was wrong, but because it interrupted a pattern that had given me a sense of worth. Being fast, responsive, and available had become part of how I proved that I was good. So when I stopped doing that, I felt strangely empty. I felt that too. There's this moment where you're no longer overgiving, but you also haven't yet learned how to rest without guilt. And that in-between space can feel disorienting, like you've stepped out of a role, but haven't found the ground underneath yet. Which is why daily selfishness isn't about immediately feeling better. It's about tolerating the discomfort of change without interpreting it as failure. Letting the nervous system recalibrate. Letting your identity loosen from usefulness. And another thing that surprised me was how often selfishness showed up as leaving earlier. Not in an angry way, not with a big explanation. Just noticing the moment when my energy shifted from engaged to depleted and allowing that moment to matter. Yes. Leaving before resentment builds. Stopping before exhaustion turns into numbness. Ending conversations while they're still kind. Those choices look small from the outside, but internally they rebuild trust. Because every time you listen to that signal and respond to it, your body learns something new. It learns that it doesn't have to escalate its warnings, that it doesn't need to shut down or scream to be heard. And over time, that creates a completely different internal climate. You're no longer living in constant anticipation of collapse. You start feeling safer inside yourself. Not because life becomes easier, but because you're no longer abandoning yourself in it. Which also changes how you show up for others. You become clearer, more honest, less performative. You stop offering care you can't sustain. And strangely, that makes your presence more meaningful. Because it's real. Not filtered through obligation or fear. Just grounded. I think that's the part people don't expect. That choosing yourself doesn't shrink your world. It stabilizes it. You may do less, but what you do comes from capacity rather than depletion. And that's what makes this version of selfishness so different from the one we were taught to fear. It doesn't isolate you. It doesn't harden you. It brings you back into relationship, with yourself first and then with others, in a way that doesn't cost you your life force. Maybe that's the real measure. Not whether a choice looks selfish from the outside, but whether it allows you to stay present in your own life. I keep thinking about how radical this actually is, not in the way social media uses the word radical, but in a quieter, deeper sense. Because what we're really talking about isn't becoming harsher or more individualistic. It's about relearning how to belong to yourself. And that feels especially important now at the beginning of a new year, when everyone is being pushed to become more, do more, fix more. Yes. January always carries this pressure to optimize your life, to redesign yourself like a project. And what feels different about this invitation is that it's not asking you to add anything. It's asking you to remove what was never yours to carry in the first place. Exactly. Instead of asking, what should I become this year? It's asking, what can I finally stop sacrificing? What parts of myself have I been silencing in order to be acceptable, productive, or easy to be around? And when you frame it that way, being selfish stops sounding like a moral failure. It starts sounding like an act of repair, like tending to something that's been neglected for too long. I think this year is quietly inviting people to rebuild their inner survival instinct. Not the aggressive kind, but the one that knows when to rest, when to pull back, when to protect energy instead of offering it endlessly. The instinct that says, I matter enough to stay alive inside my own life. And that instinct isn't anti-community. It's actually what makes community sustainable. Because when people are connected to themselves, they don't relate through resentment, obligation, or burnout. They relate through choice, which changes everything. Because choice carries honesty. And honesty creates relationships that can actually breathe. I also think it's important to say this clearly. Choosing yourself won't make everything instantly peaceful. There will still be moments of doubt. Moments where you wonder if you're doing it wrong. Moments where guilt shows up, not because you're harming anyone, but because you're breaking an old contract. And that's okay. Guilt doesn't always mean you're doing something bad. Sometimes it just means you're doing something new. Something unfamiliar to your nervous system. So if someone is listening right now and thinking, I want this, but I don't know how to live it perfectly, the answer is you don't have to. This isn't about mastery. It's about honesty. About checking in more often than you override. About choosing yourself one moment at a time. And letting those moments add up. Letting them slowly change how safe you feel inside your own body. Letting them teach you that you don't need to disappear in order to belong. Maybe that's the real shift this year is asking for. Not becoming better humans, but becoming more present ones. Present enough to notice when we're tired. Present enough to stop before we break. Present enough to live, not just perform living. And if there's one thing we hope people take from this episode, it's this: you're not broken for wanting more space, more rest, more honesty. You're responding to something very old and very human inside you. So if this year you choose to be a little more selfish, not in a loud way, not in a defensive way, but in a way that keeps you connected to yourself, that's not a failure of morality. That's alignment with life. Thank you for being here with us, for taking this time for yourself, and for listening so openly. This is Coremates, and I'm here again with Elen. We'll be here every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock with a new long-form episode, diving deeply into a new subject each week: psychology, neuroscience, daily life, and everything in between. If this conversation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe. It really helps us build this space and keep these conversations going. And maybe send this episode to someone who needs permission to choose themselves a little more this year. Until next Sunday, take care of yourself. Not someday. Today.